Our next discussant is Nigel Nayling. His presentation is a timber analysis of the Warwick, dating, provenance, and resources. Nigel worked with us last season. He analyzed our samples during the second season. He also came to Bermuda and took his own sample, which were much better than what we took the season before, and he provided the analysis and dating of the timbers. Please welcome Nigel Nayling.
Thank you. One of these very interesting vessels from Bermuda, that it could be dating to the Armada, it could be from any date. I've worked on quite a number of shipwrecks. I've worked on shipwrecks that I've been told are late 17th century English warships, which have turned out to be Dutch merchantmen as a result of doing the dendrochronology. And I feared I might be causing some trouble by producing some results. These were a limited number of samples, but it was very useful in providing us the ability to decide whether there was potential in this wreck. Many 17th century wrecks I've looked at have fast-grown timbers with relatively few rings, which don't lend themselves to tree ring analysis. And these are my very glorious and polished sections of those samples. Essentially, a couple of large pieces of oak from major structural items, and some smaller pieces from planking and even from a trinelle, so that we could begin to look at timber species usage. And of those pieces, 3 I was able to measure their ring widths. I won't go into the details of dendrochronological method. And they cross-matched against each other and produced a mean which could be dated against British curves. So yes, British, that's a good start. And of those, one of those pieces had some sapwood on its outer edge, which allows us to estimate the date range for the felling of the parent tree, as indicated by this bar diagram at the bottom, which, much to my relief, says 1609 to 1642, which it would be consistent with the identification of the site as the Warwick, so I wasn't going to get shot. And this is just the brief details of those 10 samples and the outcomes of them. The main conclusions that came from this was that the site, the timber from its construction came from southern Britain. We can't be really more precise than that, probably at the moment at least, with this dating range for one timber. And also that of the outer planking, we have a mixture here of species, oak and elm. And that there was a sheathing of oak. Thanks to Piotr, we understand its different levels of planking and sheathing. And my last conclusion was a clear steer that a very good idea would be to get me out to Bermuda. That there's certainly potential there, and that we really ought to be looking, I was arguing, for an extensive program, both to ensure that we got a clear identification in terms of dating, and that we looked for surviving timbers with surviving original bark edge, which could give us dating to the year, and also to get a broader understanding of the nature and the character of the timber employed in its construction, given very variable levels of usage of different types of forestry product in a whole range of 17th century vessels that I've looked at. So we set ourselves some clear research questions. When was the ship constructed? Well, I can't tell that, but I can tell when the trees are cut down. Where did that timber come from? And whether that tells us something about the nature of the resource that's being employed, the nature of the forest and woodland that was being exploited. And also, as a bit of a tag on the bottom, that I had heard rumours about barrels and bear barrels being salvaged by Butler, and that perhaps there would be other artefactual material we could look at that could characterise something about the nature of the cargo on board. To cut a long story short, we established a dendrochronology laboratory in Bermuda that has some interesting challenges in security in airports. But thanks to the fantastic support of the rest of the team, this turned out to be very successful. On a very, very busy excavation and recording site, in between all those profiles and sticks and straws and other archaeologists, I worked on areas which had been previously recorded. I was overjoyed to find the whole wreck exposed for my pleasure, and proceeded to take slice samples from as many different structural elements of the wreck as we could afford. We certainly wanted to find framing timbers with surviving bark edge, but as soon became clear, ceiling, stringers, and even planking retained sufficient rings to merit analysis. So I was taking hand slices in beautifully pre-recorded places, sometimes taking the label away with me, sorry, and rapidly recording through a combination of photography, notice the missing pieces, and some rough cross-sections, the nature of the material, and given the relatively benign conditions, being able to get a feel for which timbers we're going to deliver. Taking samples is relatively strenuous, air-consuming in our limited air supply, and we wanted to maximize results. So I was assessing timbers on the seabed, deciding which ones were worth sampling, which ones to leave behind, so that we could maximize results. And then marking on a very rough drawing the locations of each sample, which in due course we'll need to start adding identifications. These are all samples of oak which have been dated, and there's a lot more to add on to here. I just started doing this last night. I've got 60 samples that we took to add on to this plan. And then each sample that came out of the water, not everyone had to be filmed, but the odd one, we'd then record those cross-sections, and those cross-sections have actually been recorded as well as one-to-one profiles to provide additional information about the scantling of the timbers, and then recorded in our field dendrochronology laboratory. And the results of dating available to us on the same day that we'd taken samples, feedback to modify our sampling strategy for the next day. Looking at the cross-sections, we found plenty of material suitable with surviving sapwood and bark edge. We found plenty of evidence for exposure to wood borers, and I would certainly concur that the area that had been previously excavated was very much more deteriorated. We were still, however, able to measure these samples and date them, even though there are more holes left than there are timber. It's something of a challenge, but nonetheless, very good survival, including survival on this bottom slide of the surviving bark edge. This is from a tree which we know was cut down probably after May of the year it was felled in, but before the end of July. So this is the level of precision of dating when you can find partial last ring with the early wood vessels that are set in the spring before the laying down of the late wood in August and September, before the tree goes into dormancy. So we were able to take 12 samples from framing, and most of which produced datable material. The ceiling and the stringers were all oak, many surprisingly containing large amounts of sapwood. Some of those chamfers are not chamfers, they're the edge of the original tree. So again, we've got plenty of evidence from the stringers and the ceiling. So the interior planking, which normally I would look at with some disdain and not expect to get any datable material from, proved very productive. And even some of the outer hull, we sampled one of those whales with that characteristic step in it. And we didn't sample the elm planking, apart from to confirm identification. And we'll be able to plot the distribution. There's a very clear distribution with the oak whale at P1, and then we've got runs of inner planking of oak, and then planking of elm as well. So we need to plot that out onto some of our profiles and see what that means. The thing that surprised me the most is the fact that a lot of these planks were made out of the same very mature, slow-grown oak trees, which characterize the nature of the raw material employed in the rest of the hull. This is completely at odds with what one would expect to find in most of our Iberian vessels, which seem to be made from relatively fast-grown, highly managed woodland. Perhaps this reflects an excessively rich owner able to access exceedingly high-value woodland for construction. This is one of our outstanding questions. Here's the answer to the question, which I was nagged for day after day, what dates the ship. As you can see, not all of our samples have bark edge, but a significant number of them do. A few we weren't absolutely sure about, possibly 1616, but we know that one of those, one tree was felled between September 1616 and April 1617, and that 3 timbers came from trees felled in that summer of 1617, probably between May and July. I can't get any better than that, I'm afraid, unless someone actually scribes the date into one of the timbers for me. And I think this has already pervaded everyone's thinking about the ship. I think there's been so many hints this morning about the way that this has defined and confirmed suspicions about the newness of the ship, the lack of repairs. And all of that material is coming from somewhere in southern Britain. We have got material from elsewhere, however, and I was allowed to sample both fragments of radial material that was stored on the seabed, but also a number of artifacts held in the museum, mostly from stayed vessels. And we found a small group of material, which is coming from the Baltic somewhere. I don't know exactly where, and we need to do more research on this. And also material from France. So I'm not sure if your beer comes from France, but there might have been a few barrels of wine on board. I'm surprised they survived that 10-week voyage. They wouldn't have done it if I was on board. And who knows what was coming in the Baltic barrels. It may be some disgusting herring. Who knows? But this might hint at some other provisioning on the ship. Clearly, this material wasn't available in Bermuda. So a few conclusions. One of the things I would say is that the way in which I was allowed to integrate into the field team in what was a very busy final field season was greatly appreciated, and we were able to take extensive numbers of samples. By virtue of having a dendrochronology laboratory there, we were getting results feeding back as we developed over what was only a 10-day period of excavation, of sampling. And before I left, I knew we had the answer we needed. We were also left with some outstanding questions, as any good piece of research does. We need to research this notion of provenance. I think my feeling at the moment is we're unlikely to be able to narrow the range in terms of the actual structural timber, but we should be able to do more in terms of locating some of this artifactual material. What are the implications of this precise dating, above and beyond saying that the ship was relatively new? Where does 1617 put us in this very precise historical narrative that Emily has given us? It's clearly not the New Year's gift. It's not the White Lion. It's starting to narrow the field. One might hope that some snippet of new historical transcription or information will suddenly nail it for us. After all, it may not have been called the Warwick when it was built. It may well have had another name if we are seeing someone newly acquiring status and name and assigning it to their vessel. And equally, there's this question of what does it mean in terms of the nature of this raw material. And that, I think, is one of the relatively unusual aspects of this, that by the extensive sampling that we've carried out has given us a really clear understanding that they were exploiting very mature trees, oak trees probably in excess of 230 years old when they were felled. And that's just not the sort of timber that's lying around waiting for someone to use. Only a matter of some 20 or 30 years later, there is a preoccupation in Britain about the lack of available suitable material to meet the naval demands of the British Navy. And Pepys and Dean scour the countryside to build the 30 great ships, terrified that they cannot keep up with the French in terms of delivery of armament as far as ships are concerned. So what does this mean? Does this mean that's an exceedingly privileged source for the construction of this particular vessel? And I think this will tie in with a structural study of it and its behaviour. Is this an exceptional vessel built in a somewhat archaic form, but which has been produced by someone with access through their very high status to particularly rare and highly valuable forestry resource. And I'd like to conclude by thanking the team for supporting Gemma, who helped in the office with me on a piece of work which was very hard work, very taxing, but I think you agree, very rewarding. Thank you very much.